Again, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Honourable Minister, esteemed panellists. What they said. What more can I add to the brilliant inputs that this esteemed panel provided today, and that before that Justice Mansur Ali Shah provided in terms of climate finance? But of course, I have to earn my place on the panel. So 6 seems to be the magic number. And so I'm going to provide very quickly 6 points, which is what I've heard from this panel, but what I've heard from all morning, from the discussions that we've been listening to. And the first is we're talking about money, whether it's domestic public budgets, whether it's private finance, or whether it's international public finance. And the truth is there isn't enough of it. Not for climate finance and not for anything else. And this is a time when there's never been more of a demand for what limited budget is available. Globally, a third of least developed countries still haven't caught up with where they were before COVID. We talk a lot in Pakistan about learning poverty, but globally, 70% of 10-year-olds can't read and write because of COVID. Remediating that is going to require $2.4 trillion. Where's that money going to come from? There are countries that have lost access to capital markets. And even where countries have access to capital markets, money is more expensive than it's ever been. So there isn't enough of it. What is available is in high demand, and what is available is highly expensive. Even with climate finance, the truth is we haven't optimized it. 70% of climate finance goes towards mitigation, but we heard again and again today that mitigation isn't really the issue. There are commercial returns there. The issue is adaptation. And there's less than 30% of available finance going to that. But of all the climate finance flowing today, less than 20% goes to the global south, where the impacts of climate change are real. So that doesn't make sense. That's not money that's moving properly. So there's not just not enough money. There's not just the fact that climate finance money that is available isn't being targeted correctly, but the 2 silver bullets that are constantly referred to are incredibly fragile. One is carbon markets. And I do think there's huge potential for carbon markets, particularly in the compliance markets that are beginning to emerge. We have a lot of confidence, for example, in ICAO, the aviation compliance market that is being developed. But in the voluntary carbon market, it's gone from $2 billion in transactions in 2022 to less than 725 million. That's less than half, just 1 year later. So the carbon markets aren't yet where they need to be, and even as they grow, they're not going to be enough. Of course, the second silver bullet everybody talks about is private finance. And that's going to be what has to drive finance for adaptation as well as for mitigation. And it's funny, Honourable Minister, you started your talk this morning by talking about macroeconomic stability and the enormous progress that Pakistan has made in righting the ship of state finances. And that is so important because one of the reasons private finance isn't flowing is because of macroeconomic instability and uncertainty. It's because at the sector level, there are policies that don't make sense. There are disincentives. At the project level, there isn't a pipeline of bankable projects. Project developers aren't creditworthy. They don't know how to design a business plan. So the private sector is sitting on the sidelines. There are still issues. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, because I think it's important. But the second is to reflect something that the Honourable Minister started with, which is the time for investing in projects is over. The time for building new economies has arrived. It's no longer about the what, it's about the how. It's about the plumbing. You know, these days having the title of climate change director in a US-based institution is a little bit scary. I worry sometimes that the big eye of Mordor for any Lord of the Rings fans will be attracted to people with those sorts of titles. I'm thinking of changing my title to Chief Plumber, because honestly, plumbing is where the future of climate finance has to lie. And it's plumbing for domestic budgets and for private sector, private finance. Let me start with the public sector, and you've heard it on this panel. The importance of thinking about mobilizing climate finance through taxes and expenditures, through procurement, which we don't hear enough about, but which are market makers, which are price makers in the market. But the mother of all policy reforms that will mobilize climate finance, for which plumbing is absolutely critical, is subsidies. Globally, there's over $1.5 trillion worth of subsidies just in energy, agriculture, and fisheries alone. That $1.5 trillion of direct expenditure at a time when countries are in fiscal crisis, when countries are in huge debt distress, when countries in sub-Saharan Africa are paying more to pay the interest on their debt than they have available for health and education spending. That $1.5 trillion in subsidy expenditure is causing another $5 trillion worth of damage. That over $7 trillion of cost is the size of the Mexican economy. Subsidies need to have a seat on the G20. They're that important when it comes to spending, when it comes to creating cost. So subsidy reform has to happen. I was lucky enough to participate in the UN Convention on Combating Desertification's COP16 in Saudi Arabia in December. And the big news that the UNCCD Secretariat brought out was the need for $1 billion a day to combat drought, desertification, and land degradation. That's a lot of money. The truth is, the world spends almost $2 billion a day, twice as much, on agricultural subsidies. Here in Pakistan, the subsidy to natural gas for chemical fertilizer producers is an example. We've done some modeling, and for every 10% increase in fertilizer on land, at best, on-farm productivity increases are less than 2.5%. But that 10% increase in fertilizer application is leading to over 4% increase in respiratory illness. That doesn't make sense. That's not good math at a time of fiscal crisis. So subsidies have to be worked on. The second part of plumbing, of course, is private finance and capital markets. And that's going to require three things. And again, you heard it from the panel. It's going to require financial engineering. Ourselves and the European Investment Bank like to fight over who issued the first green bond. Since they're not on this panel, I'm going to say we did in 2008. And the green bond market has grown enormously since then. Ourselves, we have issued $19 billion in 222 bonds in 28 currencies in the last several years. Globally, the green bond market is worth over $600 billion. It sounds like a lot. It's not. It's less than 0.5% of the total bond market. And the dirty secret, of course, is that green bonds aren't price differentiated on the market. You're not getting cheaper interest by issuing green bonds anymore. There isn't a price difference. There is a price difference in the sustainability-linked bond market, sustainability-linked loan market. And so that's where the financial engineering is going, because again, the cost of capital matters when it comes to plumbing in the private sector. But it's not just about financial engineering, it's about understanding risk in the capital markets. We worked with the Central Bank of Malaysia to understand how much of their commercial loan portfolio was vulnerable to climate shocks. Turns out it's over half, it's 54%. Think about what that would mean for a financial crisis. And it's not just about understanding risk, it's about disclosing risk. It's about figuring out how to get local money markets to price risk better for new climate technologies, so that they're able to support the local taxi driver who wants to buy a better, more fuel-efficient small truck or motorcycle, which they're not doing right now. That's why Pakistan's development of the National Climate Finance Strategy has been such a success, because it's exactly looking not just at the what, but the how and the plumbing. But finally, there's two things very quickly that I think we shouldn't ignore. I started by talking about the fact that there's not enough money. Too often at these conferences, at climate COPs, we talk about the quantity of money, but the truth is we also need to talk about the quality of money. And you heard about that here today, in particular the issues around access and impact. We talk a lot about international public climate finance and the Green Climate Fund, the GEF. And you heard from the minister, the money doesn't move quickly enough. The GEF, one of the longest green funds that exists, has a very convoluted way of approving projects. A country designs a project. That project has to be reviewed by an intermediary agency like the World Bank or UNDP. Our work is then reviewed by the GEF Secretariat. The GEF Secretariat's work is reviewed by their Science Technical Advisory Panel, and the STOP panel's work is reviewed by the GEF Council. That cannot be how to run a business. That's why it takes so long. And this is where plumbing matters too, because it makes no sense in a world where we talk about a climate emergency that the paperwork to access international public climate finance is ridiculously complex. Climate finance is hard enough to fix, but surely we can fix paperwork. Surely we can make it easier to access these funds by making the questions that are asked, the paperwork that is demanded, simpler. And finally, it's not just about access, it's about impact. With so little money, every dollar, every rupee that is spent needs to be spent on what works. And when something isn't working, we need to stop spending money on it. And the only way we know what's working, what's not working, is through data. But we don't have good data. We have a terrible tragedy of data fragmentation. We don't have common methodologies. We're not measuring the same things. We can't compare what's happening. And until we fix those problems, we will never know what is working and what's not. So I'll finish by saying climate finance is development finance. It's domestic public budgets. It's fiscal space. It's taxes and spending. It's your local bank. It's everything. And we shouldn't forget that while there are no silver bullets, when it comes to climate finance, we need to remember the movie title, that we have to look for it everywhere, from everyone, and all at once. Thank you.